I suppose it would basically maybe depend on what are your ambitions as a company. I mean, are you planning on growing your team to a larger, multiple different geographical locations, or do you think you want to stay to a team of that size working within 4 physical walls?
Well, let's just say the small to medium term, you would not look at moving on to 2 or 3 locations.
Yeah.
Well, and that's where I think providers like Bebop have a really good value proposition, because they're much more oriented towards the single artist or to the small group of artists that are contributing to a particular project, because you don't need to invest in all the licenses yourself. You don't have to have that IT overhead of how do you deploy and maintain these kinds of things. So they're thinking through that for the smaller shots in the same way that the cloud platform thinks through all of that for the entire world. So I think that's the kind of solution to look at, because they can
To that question, though, I think I'd go even like more basic than that and say that it comes down to, where is your studio location? What kind of ISP access do you have to that location? Is it possible to get a direct connect to a cloud provider? And if so, what does that cost you on a monthly basis? You may look at that information alone and say, doesn't make sense to leverage cloud solutions because of the cost of the bandwidth alone. You could look at your startup, and maybe it's $50,000 all in for a 3-year investment for the infrastructure you need to operate, and then maybe cloud becomes the thing that allows you to be opportunistic with taking on work that you otherwise wouldn't be able to handle within the facility that you've built out. And that's where you can start to think about the expansion. We usually find with smaller studios that the barrier is the bandwidth piece and the location that they're in. Sometimes it's in an apartment. Sometimes it's in a smaller studio that doesn't have the connectivity they need to get to a direct connect, or it's too expensive.
Yeah, just to very good point. But also, you just make sure the right pillars of infrastructure are there. And I think there's new technologies coming up that are helping that, as we were speaking about over there, with the advent of 5G, that might basically allow you to move into a premises that doesn't have fiber in the building, that you don't have to dig to put fiber into the building, kind of short term in that building, where it's potentially cheaper rent and all the rest of it. So does that help? Cool.
So going off his question, so it makes sense when you're a bigger studio and you have dedicated circuits getting you to this connectivity, but to the person who's at home who doesn't have QoS, and how are you providing that type of experience? Even if 5G, with all this traffic, how are you going to be able to prioritize those packets to make it to have a good experience on, I guess, the Teradici side?
Yeah, I can maybe just quickly add that. Maybe Ian, if you want to add it on the Teradici side. So we've looked at that in the UK, and there are basically providers that kind of offer a small business package, and the thing is though, but it's really down to how the ISP or the carriers basically will prioritize your traffic above, say, your neighbor watching Netflix, for example. And so there are some options out there that will basically treat your ISP at home or a small office basically above everyone else. And so they are out there, and that goes a long way to kind of help with that.
But at some point they're uplinking to a bigger knob, right? And your QoS at that point is gone, or does it transfer through and continue on?
I would just say it depends on the carrier in question. There's not a black and white answer, but
I think today most telcos are not respecting QoS.
Yeah.
Once it gets past your gateway,
That's it.
they don't care.
Yeah.
I think you should also ask it's about your artists as well. I work friends who worked with a studio who had an LA office and a New York office, and the New York office was promoting into LA. And and I've heard of sort of similar operations at other studios, and it became a personnel problem because you had certain people who could not work with a 80, 70 millisecond lag, just couldn't, and others who were great and did fantastic work. And so you sort of found that there are just some artists who they're so fast that they need a box in front of them with attached storage, and there's no other way that they can work.
Yeah.
And there's other artists who they're maybe more deliberative, or their style of work allows them to work with I worked from LA to Singapore, which was I forget, it was 2,000 milliseconds. And it's like, you know, so you have to be able to kind of go, can you do a thing and then go do something and then come back? You know, it really depends on the people.
So it really depends on the role.
Yeah.
Again, the network carriers, but in order to kind of circumvent some of that, you can also take a look at things basically from like caching servers, software-defined caching servers that can help get around that. So over high latency circuits and all the rest of it, I mean, it might not be deploying it for like one person sitting in New York, but if you have a team of 10 people, then it might start making more financial sense.
Have you found like there's certain workflows that just don't translate well? Like I remember in the beginning it was like Wacom on Teradici, too much delay, nobody wants it. So then I think you guys worked on rewriting the USB.
Yeah, we added like local termination.
Right, and
Plus,
now
plus,
that's the thing. Is there a certain type of workflow that has been identified as just it's not good enough yet?
Well, anything with, and I'll let Ian, I mean, the guys at Teradici have done a really good job because we've been kind of testing this with every beta release, and so it is greatly improved. But we have people using Photoshop remotely with a zero client and no huge complaints. But I always stress, you know, like you have got to, if you're using the cheapest broadband provider at home, you're probably going to have issues.
It's also about regional availability because
Yeah, I guess to Joe's point, right? You got to measure it out because there's sub 10 millisecond latency and sub 5 in some cities to your local production, and then never mind. So you have this front end. We're just talking about the protocol part, but remember you're getting all these gains in the rest of the workflow where you've now got huge pipes between your content, which is now in the cloud, not locally. So you're not uploading and downloading anymore.
and are your production facilities talking directly to each other? So if you've got someone in LA and someone in New York and they're trying to remote in, is that workstation that they're accessing from New York actually sitting out here? Or can you cloudify that and say, well, there's a data center on the East Coast that's pretty close to New York, serve your workstation from there, share the data with somebody on the West Coast that's running out of a West Coast DC, and then those latency issues go away. I mean, not entirely, but then you're only dealing with a few milliseconds instead of however long it takes to go all the way across the country.
Ian, why don't you just maybe go into a bit about the Wacom side of things?
Yeah, I mean, I work with Amazon Workspaces as my day-to-day VDI system, and then of course I have all graphics environments and so on, and I work from home 10 or 20% of the time, dialing into Portland or Vancouver. So when you're less than about 10 or 15 milliseconds latency, you can remote the USB drivers from your tablet device, and they can be terminated at the endpoint, which could, at the the host side, which could be on a data center or could be in a public cloud. Once you get between 10 and 25 milliseconds of latency, depending on, very much role dependent, right? An animator is going to have a different requirement to an editor, but somewhere between 10 to 15 milliseconds, that latency becomes uncomfortable, and up to about 25, most artists will tolerate. If you terminate the USB signals at the client side, which means you present the response of the tablet pen back immediately, as well as sending it off to the host side, so you effectively have two masters side by side. And it's amazing when you turn this on, it's as if you get rid of this huge big gooey feel, and you suddenly get this, your brain can deal with the notion as long as it can see both sensors, and so you can work within very fine drawings and so on. And then between 25 and 40 milliseconds, I would say that becomes highly noticeable, and some artists will tolerate it with, but they're not going to be fully productive, right? And then above that, it's not the right environment. But once you're in 40, 50 milliseconds, you've got a lot of provider opportunities.
Yeah. And I also think, and one way to help kind of combat latency is when going over the public internet, you use things like tier 1 ISPs, for example, rather than tier 2 or tier 3. I mean, there's less hops. It's basically really, really, like we've seen, basically, it really helps bring the latency down in general, which is also going to benefit things like file servers and any other services you have all going over that. It's not just things like Teradici or RGS or Blast or whatever else, but like people don't complain about it, but if you have like, say, caching servers spread around over high latency, they don't like that either. And so basically, high latency is bad. It's just that people don't see the effects of it because they're not computers, and so they just want that visual feedback. I mean, a caching server is not going to moan at you. It's just going to sometimes take a little longer for the files to populate. So But it's just, I think it's accumulation of attacking the problem from several perspectives that helps improve the overall solution. And as connectivity gets faster, there's more dark fiber run and all, throughout the cities and everything else. It will get better. So cool. I think we've got time for one more question. Then I think the time is really up. Any last one? Sure.
Yeah. This assumes, of course, constant 10% uptime. Is there any risk uptime for cloud systems? Is there any risk assessment that any of you have done about those possibilities of taking an entire shop down, which I've heard happen?
Yeah.
I'll answer that quickly, then I'll let you guys. So yes, we basically run on-prem. We use the cloud. I can tell you right now, in London we have more power outages than when the cloud goes down, but everyone's offline. So the cloud, there are outages here there, but it's far less than what we experience with our on-prem power requirements or aircon not working or whatever. So it does happen, but we also experience downtime by not using the cloud as well. So.
And availability is part of security. So I mean, as long as you geographically put out all your hosts in a way that you think about it beforehand, then you should be able to kind of mitigate any kind of local outages, either in local offices or local at the hub. So I mean, I think that when you do the VDI infrastructure, if you set it up in a way that availability is kind of like your consideration, if you want to have a lot of 11 nines or something, you want to make sure that you want to put into multiple regions, and I know there's a trade-off between cost, right, at that point, but you want to put into the multiple availability zones and spread it out over geographic regions. And like you were talking about before, to deal with latency, you just have to put multiple VDI infrastructure at different edge points, and then that's part of how you can somehow have to get around it, because you can't expect to have one centralized location of VDI infrastructure and keep the costs low and then keep fighting latency issues.
Yeah, I mean that's what's fundamental to building for security and for reliability, is that you need to plan for resiliency. That at some point something's going to crash, or your network is going to disappear, or whatever. It's going to happen on your desktop machine. It's going to happen on your cloud machine. As a provider, we can't guarantee with absolute certainty that something isn't going to go wrong, because it always will. But if you design for recoverability and you know how to react to a scenario, whether that's a breach or a failure or what have you, then the amount of impact that that's going to have on you is going to be minimized versus just assuming everything is hunky-dory and that your workstation will always be there.
Yeah, I'd also say it will probably be hybrid for a while until things settle down, right? But I will also say, for those companies that are all in outside our industry, like the Netflixes and the Amazons, shopping front, they have just amazing conference talks about how battle hardened they are and how much it takes to kill them now. And they have those chaos monkey things running around, right? That's like the famous thing where they sabotage themselves just to show how well they can hold up. It's impressive. And again, it's to the architectural style that they chose. They're all a microservices shop. That's why I got interested in it. Just watching how battle hardened they were. I think you'll be more reliant on those than you would on maybe on-prem at some point, because more vulnerabilities on your on-premise than it is on that scattershot, hard to kill infrastructure that you can build.
In fact, most of the on-premises environments actually don't have a lot of disaster recovery, or even data protection built into them, at least in my experience. And so sometimes actually moving the cloud, like you said, is allowing a more resilient strategy. Did you have any comments you want to make about the production that we were working with that was using a single bucket with multiple vendors, and how they were thinking about availability in the event that something happened and suddenly production's down?
Well, yeah, I mean, that was when this whole thing started. And interestingly, this was driven not by the large company, but by production itself. They're the ones who wanted to try to create this system. And then the large company was like, oh, wait, you're doing what? Let's see if we can integrate that in a deeper way. But yeah, that was a big problem, was how can a you know how production is. They'll if something goes down, they'll find another way to do it. If the camera stops working, they'll go draw it on paper. I mean, they'll figure out a way to keep shooting, right? They've got to keep going. And so, what happens if they can't ingest? What happens if the ingest is working but it doesn't transfer to the cloud? I mean, and so we have to kind of have solutions for all that. And so we have the basic one is that we have on-prem infrastructure so that when an ingest of all of the camera footage is done, it sits there. And it's, if the cloud connection is down, then it doesn't go anywhere, but it's ready. And the minute cloud connection comes up, it starts going to the cloud, and the rest of the pipeline will start picking up and doing what it was. So the worst case is you call the vendor and say, well, I guess the shop's going to be a day later because, we're backed up here. And we look at it and say, okay, well, we now have to process not, we have an on-prem CloudFront, ColorFront that's designed to do transcodes at a certain rate. And it's like, okay, well, that's not going to handle this backlog. So what do we do? Okay, well, we'll spin up a bunch of cloud instances, and we'll just render a whole crap ton in the cloud, and we'll do it that way. And so we'll focus on uploading rather than transcoding, or we'll just grab a bunch of machines, transcode, and upload the smaller files, and then we'll come back with the larger full data set. So we have kind of workaround solutions for a lot of these, but it does require that I wouldn't necessarily have thought of all of those. It was them kind of saying, okay, what do we do when this breaks? What do we do in this breaks?
It kind of goes back to Doug's point about being really close to the production teams when it comes to microservices. Yeah. When it comes to moving towards this kind of a model, be very close with the production on the workarounds in the event of failures or outages.
Yeah. Cool. I think that's probably about it. But maybe my last question for you guys is: I hope you've all learned something interesting and useful. I really hope you've enjoyed your time, and thank you for your time today. And thanks for coming. And we'll be, I'm sure, in the hallway for a bit if you guys want to chat after. But thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.